Day 10. Imagine that a boxer gets into the ring for a fight, but his opponent never shows up. What's he supposed to do? With everyone watching, he'd look kind of silly if he just stood there. But with good showmanship and clever image management, he could maybe emphasize his walkover victory with some celebratory air punches, with a manly display of force. Well, that seems to be what a large portion of the U.S. Navy is engaged in the Caribbean on October 25th, 1962. This is TimeGhost, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Indy Neidell. Today, the U.S. enforcement of its blockade of Cuba continues, despite the fact that the Soviets seem to have turned back all their ships. But we know that 4 Soviet submarines are still on their way to Cuba. Yesterday, the U.S. administration noted that the Russians were respecting the blockade, although the military had noticed already 2 days ago. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev wrote to U.S. President John F. Kennedy with a forceful rebuke of the U.S. blockade, and the U.S. preparations to confront the Soviets at the United Nations continued. This confrontation is incredibly important for the Americans, as they need the rest of the world to have no doubt whatsoever that the Soviets have installed both mid- and intermediate-range ballistic missiles on Cuba. Up until now, the USSR has neither denied nor confirmed this, and while most US allies believe it, the world public might not, and the Eastern Bloc countries stand with the Soviets. All over the world, protests against the blockade have been erupting. In Eastern Europe, well, in all of Europe, and Latin America, the Soviets have mobilized their communist connections to besiege U.S. embassies and demand an end to the blockade. This is no mere exercise in grandstanding. Now, remember that the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, has so far been the only person in the American administration to vocally oppose all forceful actions to resolve the crisis, including the blockade. His preferred course of action would be negotiating the closure of American foreign military bases and removing the American missiles in Turkey and Italy in exchange for the Soviets leaving Cuba. Today, he must confront the Soviets in open session at the UN in front of the TV cameras of the entire world. Unlike the Navy, Stevenson will most certainly meet his opponent, USSR's ambassador to the UN, Valerian Zorin, in the ring. Zorin is a formidable opponent. He's sharp, he's gifted in rhetoric. He is actually also something of a sad figure, which we won't find out until after his death 2 decades from now. See, he didn't really want to be a diplomat at all, actually. His real passion is music, and he deeply regrets only being an amateur and also never being a published poet. Anyhow, there is grave doubt by many on XCOM, the U.S. committee dealing with the crisis, that Stevenson is really up to the task. Loads of pressure has been brought to bear on President Kennedy to bring in someone else. Instead, Kennedy has stood by Stevenson and called in their mutual friend and presidential advisor, John J. McCloy, as moral support for good old Adlai. Stevenson has promised to stand his ground. But it doesn't look great when he starts off in his traditional diplomatic and conciliatory tone.
My government is most anxious to effect a peaceful resolution of this affair. We continue to hope that the Soviet Union will work with us to diminish not only the new danger which has suddenly shadowed the peace, but all of the conflicts that divide the world.
He vacillates a bit more, but then begins to pick up speed.
The argument in its essence of the Soviet Union is that it was not the Soviet Union which created this threat to peace by secretly installing these weapons in Cuba, but that it was the United States which created this crisis by discovering and reporting these installations. This is the first time, I confess, that I've ever heard it said that the crime is not the burglar, but the discovery of the burglar, and that the threat is not the clandestine missiles in Cuba, but their discovery and the limited measures taken to quarantine further infection.
His arguments get stronger and stronger, and then he goes off script and delivers what he has promised his president.
And finally, the other day, Mr. Zorin, I remind you that you didn't deny the existence of these weapons. Instead, we heard that they had suddenly become defensive weapons. But today, again, if I heard you correctly, you now say they don't exist, or that we haven't proved they exist. With another fine flood of rhetorical scorn. All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
You're in the court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly. I should like to say,
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон.
So, will you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
Stevenson then shows the photographs of the missile sites, most importantly, the low-altitude shots taken 2 days ago. He explains to the council in detail what they are looking at and asks again if Zorin denies the existence of Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba in view of this irrefutable proof. Zorin once again obfuscates. Stevenson has stood his ground and has made the USSR look like the bad guys. In the roughly 1 hour that his presentation lasts, he has done more than influence world politics on an historical level. He has also made television history. Ever since, this moment has been replayed again and again as an iconic moment of the Cold War. Meanwhile, Khrushchev has already decided to throw in the towel. Hours before the confrontation in the UN, the Soviet Presidium has met to discuss the crisis again. During the night, they have received another direct letter from President Kennedy, imploring them to not do anything rash and to initiate negotiations. Khrushchev opens the meeting with a concession of defeat. He says, "The further course of events is proceeding in the following way. The Americans say that the missile installations in Cuba must be dismantled. Perhaps this will need to be done. This is not capitulation on our part, because if we fire, they will also fire. There is no doubt that the Americans became frightened. This is clear. Kennedy was sleeping with a wooden knife." Mikoyan asks, "Why with a wooden knife?" Referring to the pre-toilet paper way of cleaning oneself with a wooden stick, Khrushchev replies, "When a man goes bear hunting for the first time, he takes with him a wooden knife so that it will be easier to clean his trousers." Now, at this moment, Nikita Khrushchev has sealed his political fate. His jest is the beginning of a long row of attempts to pitch the now failed Operation Anadir as a success because it scared the Americans. In fact, he had used some of his last political clout to sell the idea in the first place. It will take another 2 years for the rest of the men in the room to oust him and seize power, but in 1964 they will. However, although the Presidium agrees unanimously and starts drafting a letter to Kennedy offering to withdraw the missiles if the US promises to not invade Cuba, the crisis is not over by a long shot. Like I've said many times in this series, when you let out the leash on the dogs of war, it risks slipping out of your hand entirely. And that is what happens right now. Around Cuba, the US Navy is circling, looking for something to do, or at least someone to intercept. They want to stop and board 2 tankers, but since the Soviets look like they're respecting the blockade on arms deliveries, the White House is uncertain. Within the military and ExComm, people now begin to worry that it will look like they're not enforcing the blockade if they don't board some vessel, even one that they know they'll let through. On the other hand, they don't want to provoke the Soviets.
Have we got any other ships we can board now? There will, non-Soviet ships, there are many. But in order to allow Admiral Dennison to lay on a plan for doing that, we should give him instructions to do so very promptly. I think that'd be highly desirable.
Finally, in order to not provoke the USSR while the prospect of negotiations at the UN are on the table, they decide to let the tankers through and go after a Lebanese freighter, the Markula, instead. There's only one problem. The Navy's lost track of it, pursuing a number of other ships that they think might be it. Well, at 10:45 p.m. Eastern Time, they find the Markula again and stop it. Tomorrow morning, it becomes the first ship to be boarded and searched by the U.S. Navy during the blockade. Today, though, the administration is not really certain what to tell the public about the blockade and if and how it's working.
Be very careful about putting out a general impression that most of them are going back, because I do pick up on it, but be on us for being warmonger. Well, we're caught with one crowd or the other. I think you don't want to censor the euphoria that's right, which I thought that is very much the message of Khrushchev, much tougher than that. I thought the statement last night was pretty good. And all of it, of course, we don't know the significance of it. You don't have to make any additional statement.
They meet in the late afternoon again to discuss what to do next. Robert Kennedy seems to be back to the idea of airstrikes, this time as a way to move the confrontation from the Soviets to the Cubans.
And ultimately, we might decide that it would be better, rather than have the confrontation with the Russians at sea, that it might be better to have knock out their missile base. That's the first step. I don't know. It might, that's more with the Cubans than with them, and we go through and we tell them to get out of that vicinity in 10 minutes, and then we go through and knock the base.
While they continue discussing this, the USSR's ambassador to the United States, Dobrynin, messages the Kremlin in Moscow that he overheard a conversation between journalists that an invasion of Cuba is imminent. Khrushchev is still drafting his letter. The surveillance flights over Cuba are being increased. 4 nuclear-armed submarines are playing cat and mouse with the U.S. Navy somewhere in the Western Atlantic. On Cuba itself, Fidel Castro is preparing his armed forces to shove the Yanks back into the ocean if they invade, or at least shoot down some of those planes that keep on invading Cuban airspace. The crisis is still growing and growing. See you on day 11, when war grows ever closer. Do not forget to subscribe, and please support us at patreon.com or timeghost.tv so that we can make more awesome history just like this. Good night, and good luck.